I'm Zev Elif, Associate Professor of Jewish History at Touro College and Hebrew Theological College. And today I'm with my very first teacher of American Jewish History, Professor Jeffrey Gurock. He is the Libby M. Clapperman Professor of Jewish History at Yeshiva University. He is the author of so many books that he won't allow me to say inform basically every paragraph I've ever written. But in 2019, his work on Parkchester, A Bronx Tale of Race and Ethnicity that came out with NYU Press. What it does, it brings together so much of your work on ethnicity, of race, of urbanization, of suburbanization in New York history in a very powerful way. And the area that I want to talk about today is the relationship, which has been discussed by many scholars, between the Jewish community and the Black community in the 1950s onward toward the 1960s. But what your book sheds light on is a new way, a new exploration into a very complicated relationship.
Well, it is a complicated relationship. The first thing I want to say about the book, by the way, is that it is somewhat autobiographical, because in the last 2 pages of the book, I reveal that I grew up in Parkchester and lived there the first 25 years of my life. And I want to tell you that one of the burdens of doing this is to separate my truth from the truth, because in addition to studying it through memoirs and newspapers and interviews, I had to constantly calibrate what people were saying as opposed to my own experiences in Parkchester. So, and that's true of anyone who's doing contemporary history, bring things up to the present day. But you asked me, the book is about race and ethnicity. When it comes to ethnicity, the major story is about the relationships, exchange relationship between the Irish and Jews in Parkchester. Jews and the Irish had a long history of not getting along, but they do get along in Parkchester. And I try to tease out to what extent, after World War II, the difficulties between Irish and Jews decline. And I keep emphasizing the idea of getting along. Doesn't mean they're great friends, but it means that, Irish and Jews go all the way back in terms of their conflict. And during the 1930s with Father Coughlin, things were very tough, but Parkchester starts in the 1940s. But you want to talk about race. So as I think about what I did in Parkchester, I realized that throughout my career, I've always had an interest in race, whether it's my book on Harlem and the people that I focused on throughout my career in writing are not the rabbis or ministers or politicians, but really the relationship of just plain folks to one another. So what I want to say about Parkchester in terms of race is several things. First of all, I tell my students now that we often talk about race and racial conflict south of the Mason-Dixon line in the period of the 50s and 60s. Before the monumental Brown versus Board Education decision, segregation is a way of life up north as well, to a great extent. And Parkchester, which is open, and there are no quotas on Jews, they live pretty well with the Irish, the Italians, and the Germans, is off limits to African Americans until 1968. And until 1954, not only is it off limits by virtue of social discrimination, but legally as well. And that's an important point to emphasize, that Jews and Blacks, or whites and Blacks in New York City, live a separate existence. I have a great story. People say I'm a decent storyteller. I have a great story. In the early 1950s, a group of Jewish communists living in Parkchester tried to desegregate the neighborhood. So they go out and they find a Black family, the Decatur, D-E-C-A-T-U-R. He's a war veteran. He's a war hero, so to speak. And they sublet their apartment to the Decaturs. Now, when you got an apartment in Parkchester, you had to sign an agreement. There were 31 things you couldn't do. You couldn't ride your bike on the sidewalk. You couldn't put rugs on the floor, all sorts of things, but you couldn't sublet the apartment. When this happens, the Metropolitan Life Insurance Corporation, MetLife, that owns Parkchester, and for New Yorkers, they also own a sister community called Stuyvesant Town. They go to court and they get the people who are subletting the apartment thrown out. They're going to throw them out. The day before the eviction is going to take place, a group of whites and blacks, communists and African-American friends, go down to Madison Avenue. They chain themselves to the desk of the people in charge of Parkchester, and they are arrested. The next day, city marshals come and they're arrested. How do I know this? Okay, because the General Counsel of Parkchester writes a law article, not in the University of Mississippi Law Journal, but in the Journal of the American Bar Association, about how he is protecting the fiduciary rights of Parkchester. And there's a little footnote to his article. He says, for more information, check out the following dates in the Daily Worker, which is the communist newspaper. Okay, so I go to the Daily Worker and I hear the entire story. So an attempt is made to desegregate Parkchester in the 1950s. They go to court, and the court upholds segregation as opposed to integration, and Parkchester remains lily white until 1968. Now, here's the autobiographical piece that I want to tease out. So I live in Parkchester from my birth in 1949 till 1974. And thinking about it, and I went to a Jewish school, I went to Ramaz, so I didn't have any black kids in my class. And the subways, and I love rapid transit, history of rapid transit. The subway, the express train that starts in Parkchester skips over the South Bronx. So growing up in Parkchester, I never had any interaction with African Americans, Latinos. I went to the playgrounds, they were never there. And it never dawned upon me as a kid. I mean, we were a family that were very interested in civil rights, and Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney in the 60s with Dr. King and Dr. Heschel. All those things were important to us, but we were never tested as far as race is concerned. Anyway, eventually the law changes, and Parkchester is supposed to be desegregated. And however, until 1968, through subterfuges of every sort, Parkchester remains lily white. And how do I know this? Because I go to the Metropolitan Life Insurance Archive, which is open to scholars. And unbeknownst to them, to Metropolitan Life, in the archives are instructions that are given to the real estate people who work for MetLife as to how to deal if Mr. Brown comes in. Mr. Brown, you're on the list. You're getting off the list soon. They never get off the list. It's very tough for white people to get off the list who didn't get in originally, but they never get off the list. Finally, in 1968, the Human Rights Commission and a young intern named Freddie Farrar, who later on became Bronx Borough President, says to Metropolitan Life, you know what? If you don't desegregate, we're not only going to continue to fine you, which was in the cost of doing business, we're going to toss you all in jail. All of a sudden, Parkchester opens to people of color. One last thing. When Parkchester is desegregated, there's very little pushback from the white population. There are no protests in the streets. I looked at some church records. I have my own synagogue experiences here. Since there are no protests, the ire, I-R-E, of whites is not raised. And in fact, the battle is not between whites and blacks. It's the battle against Metropolitan Life Insurance Corporation. So Metropolitan Life sells Parkchester to the Helmsley Group. And now for the next 30 years, the whites and blacks in Parkchester have a common enemy. It's called the Helmsleys. We try to transform Parkchester. So all these things suggest a new look at how we look at race in New York City. A, the degree of segregation. B, the power of the courts to uphold segregation. The slow process of integration. The ability of white owners to keep African Americans out, and ultimately the world changes and African Americans. And today the neighborhood is a multicultural neighborhood, And it's a very, very different community. And I've been back there. I've took my grandchildren back to see Parkchester. I showed them the apartment house where we lived. I had to explain to them that we didn't own the building. We just had a small apartment in the building. One other thing I want to say is, those of you who know my work on history of Orthodoxy or American Judaism, there's very little in the book about American Judaism, how they live their religious lives. So I wrote a companion piece called The Jewishness of Parkchester to talk about what it was like to be Jewish religiously or culturally in Parkchester. So it was a lot of fun. I mean, a lot of fun doing this.
I want to go back. Thank you. I want to go back to the invisibility that the regular people, the people that you normally write about, being unaware of conversations being had, and the stakeholdership being insurance agencies, being real estate agents, being the legal system.
Right.
Even when the tensions between white and blacks on the ground, so to speak, are invisible because your train is jumping over the South Bronx. What does that do for these people once they grow up, once they see other areas? But also, what does that say about stakeholdership in race relations in the 60s?
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by stake? You mean metropolitan life, or supposed to?
Sure, right. That you have the other people mediating these decisions. Right. We normally think about issues taking place on the water fountain,
right,
and who can drink from it. But here is a case where it's not that at all.
Well, the general population of Parkchester looks at MetLife as Papa MetLife. They're very pleased to be in Parkchester. They consider themselves chosen people, to excuse the expression, that they're able to get into Parkchester, and they're living somewhat idyllic lives here, and they're not engaged in what Parkchester is doing on the question of race. I don't think people are even thinking about it. Moreover, it's a time, 1964, there were riots in Bedford-Stuyvesant, there were riots in Harlem. Does it impact upon my family? No, we didn't. Now, those riots were not anti-Jewish. They were against the business people who happened to be Jewish. That doesn't stir up much tension. We had some friends who were in the teachers' union in the late 60s. So we're somewhat aware of these types of things. So you know what? When I look at race relations in the larger scope of things, and I've said this recently, for me, when it comes to Jews, and maybe for whites, there are three different types of Jewish attitudes. There are Jews who are very aggressive and they're activists, again, like the martyred Goodman and Schwerner. There are people on the right. For example, about 20% of the Parkchester people in 1968 vote for George Wallace. Now, I don't know what proportion of them were Jewish. And then there are people in the middle who are not engaged in these issues all along. And I think that's true of all sorts of conflicts. People are comfortable living their own lives and not getting caught up in those types of things. And in fact, since there are no street protests in Parkchester, that doesn't raise the volume, the intensity of what you might call racial conflict. Now, having said this, it's not a Pollyanna neighborhood. I have a chapter called A Mixed Reception, which is a play on words, that when African Americans move in, primarily African Americans, Latinos come in a little bit later, there's no organized pushback by whites, Jewish or Gentiles. You know what? Some of the people who I interviewed, African Americans, elderly African Americans, were people who are involved with the NAACP, the Congress of Racial Equality, the Urban League. And when Parkchester finally opens, you know what they do? They do what most white people did. They jump to the front of the line. In other words, some of them worked pro bono and some of them worked for salaried for the civil rights organizations. And they said, hey, wait a minute, Parkchester is open. We get an apartment. And some of them are still around today. And I tell my audiences, I've interviewed these people. They're elderly people. And you know who they remind me of? They remind me of my parents. Working class people, lower middle class people who are happy to be in Parkchester. By the way, they have one advantage over the life that I led as a child, and that is late in the game, after the turn of the millennium, Parkchester finally installs air conditioning. Now, I know it sounds silly, but if you're an urban historian, knowing the history of air conditioning is very important. So people ask me, why did my generation move out of Parkchester? Well, some of it has to do with affluence, but more importantly, well, part of the story is we don't want to live in an un-air-conditioned apartment. My parents grew up in tenements, so for them, it was no big deal. But for our generation, in any event, these African Americans, a mixed reception. When they move in, there are stories of people slamming the door of an elevator in people's faces, things of that sort, some nasty things said, but there's no organized resistance, which is very different. You know, at the same time period, if you look at places like Canarsie, and there's a wonderful book by Jonathan Reeder, R-I-E-D-E-R, on Canarsie about the Italians and Jews against civil rights. There's a lot of conflict. In Parkchester, you've got a lower middle class group of Jews and non-Jews who I say are pretty comfortable with African Americans, Latinos moving into their neighborhood. So it's a different take on race. It's looking at it from the bottom up and looking at, one other piece. Because I can go on forever about Parkchester, you know. We often talk about white flight in the 70s, 60s and 70s. You know the iconic image of Howard Cosell during a World Series game, looking out beyond the Yankee Stadium and saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is burning," with the decline of the Bronx. We often talk about the white flight. No one until me has looked at what I call black flight. What black flight means is when these bad neighborhoods, when these neighborhoods deteriorate because of drugs and neglect and a variety of other things, where do the solid lower middle class, working class African Americans go? They flee also. And many of them in the Bronx experience move into Parkchester. And when you have a blackout, the summer of 1977 blackout, which destroyed a large part of the Bronx. The Bronx Press Review, the local newspaper, which we used to get as kids, right, talks about the fact that there are two places in the Bronx that are unaffected by the blackout in terms of rioting: Parkchester and Riverdale. I mentioned Riverdale, that's where I live. Riverdale is the place where a goodly number of people who grew up in the Orthodox congregation migrated in the 1970s. So I got a chance to write about my friends as well, which is pretty cute, you know. So, and a few of them ended up teaching with me at Yeshiva University. Irony of ironies. So we didn't plan it that way, but it worked out that way.
Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.